Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Faye Rosenfeld, and I am the Vice President of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library. And I want to thank you so much for joining us at Live from NYPL. Whether you're here with us in person or whether you're watching us online, it is really wonderful to be together again. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Nomi Stolzenberg and David Myers, two incredibly distinguished scholars who happen to also be married to each other, to the live stage. Nomi is Nathan and Lily Chappell Chair in Law and co-director of the Center for Law, History, and Culture at USC, and David is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA. They are here from LA to speak about their monumental and fascinating new book, American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York. You can purchase copies of American Shtetl from the library shop right here after the program if you're with us in person or online, if you're joining us remotely, and all proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Or if you have a library card, which of course you all do, right? You can also check out a copy from the NYPL. Nomi and David will be joined in conversation by Elizabeth Platt. Liz is a legal scholar whose work focuses on the intersection of religious liberty and other fundamental rights, and she serves as director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School. I really want to say a special thank you to Liz for being so generous with her time and expertise and stepping in to moderate after Larissa McFarquhar unfortunately became unavailable at the last minute. And, you know, over the last 2 years plus really of programming during COVID, we've seen how our speakers and our audiences respond with incredible flexibility, graciousness, and generosity to all sorts of unexpected hurdles time and time again, and tonight was really no exception. So thank you again, Liz. So tonight's program is the annual Joy Gottesman Ungeleiter Lecture, which invites leading scholars, writers, and artists to explore themes in Jewish history, literature, and thought that are reflected in the holdings of the library's Dorot Jewish Division. For those who don't know, the Dorot Division, which is currently celebrating its 125th anniversary, is one of the world's leading collections of Hebraica and Judaica, with over 250,000 items that span the entire religious and secular history of the Jewish people. It has extensive holdings on the history of Hasidism, including numerous publications by and about Satmar Hasidim and many editions published in Kiryas Joel specifically. So we really couldn't think of a more appropriate topic for this year's program than Nomi and David's widely acclaimed American Shtetl, which sheds a new light not only on this particular segment of the Jewish community, but also on the larger complexities of American society that have enabled the Satmars of Kiryas Joel to thrive. I want to take a moment to thank the Dorot Foundation and the family of the late Joy Gottesman Ungeleiter for their generosity in making the series possible. I also want to recognize the curator of Dorot, Dr. Ludmila Shalachova, who is here with us this evening and who's doing such an incredible job connecting scholars and the public to the jewels of this extraordinary archive. And I just want to add that there's an additional reason why tonight's program is particularly special for us at Live. And that's because we feel that this program is, in a way, part of the library mishpacha. I have to translate that word, right? It means family. As you'll hear in a moment, David and Nomi have been working on this book for over 15 years. And for eight of those years, their daughter, Tali Stolzenberg Myers, was a wonderful and highly respected member of the team that produces Live and other public programs here at the New York Public Library. So we've been hearing about this incredible scholarly project for quite some time, and we are so excited and honored to be part of bringing it out into the world. I am going to bring our speakers out to the stage in just a minute. Before I do that, I just wanted to take 1 minute to tell you about what's coming up in the next week and a half as we close out our season. This Friday, June 17th, our popular monthly happy hour returns to the beautiful rooftop terrace right across the street at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library, which is the only free public rooftop terrace in Manhattan. We'll be celebrating Juneteenth and kicking off the 4th annual Schaumburg Literary Festival with an evening of readings, crafts, games, music, and of course, drinks and lots of mingling. And next week, we'll be back to close our season with programs featuring an outstanding array of writers, artists, photographers, and curators, from Jamel Bowie to Susan Meiselas, Robert Jones Jr., Pamela Sneed, Bill Goldstein, and many more. Go to nypl.org to find out. Okay, back to tonight. First, I want to let you know that Nomi and David will take your questions. If you're in the room, you can write your questions on a note card, and one of our staff members will come around and collect it. If you're watching online, you can type your question in the chat, or you can send an email to publicprograms@nypl.org. And second, while you don't have to wear a mask while you're in the audience with us tonight, we'd love it if you would. And if you need one, there's some masks right at the entrance, and we can be happy to get one for you. So thanks again for being here and for supporting Live and the New York Public Library. Your support is what helps keep all of this amazing programming free and accessible to all. Now, please welcome Nomi Stolzenberg, David Myers, and Elizabeth Platt.
Thank you so much for those lovely introductions, and I'm delighted to step in at the last minute. Very exciting to be part of an event at the New York Public Library. I want to start us off today by just giving you a bit of an opportunity to talk about the book. What is Kiryas Joel? What does this community mean? And what do you hope that we're going to take from your incredible work?
Well, I think I'll start, but let me begin by just thanking this incredible institution, the New York Public Library, this remarkable series, Faye, for your really wonderful and warm introductory words, and all of you for coming out. This is really one of the first times that we've had an opportunity to talk about the book to a live audience, and that's just a really precious opportunity. The point of origin of the book is in many ways New York. The community that stands at the center of American Shtetl is Kiryas Joel, or Kiryas Joel, New York. That means the village of Joel. It is a legally recognized municipality in the state of New York that is comprised almost entirely of Satmar Hasidic Jews who identify with the Satmar Hasidic group, one of the most stringently observant of Orthodox Jews, and particularly a strain of Orthodox Judaism known as Haredi, often translated as ultra-Orthodox or traditionalist Orthodox. The book that we wrote tells the story of the passage of Satmar Hasidim from their own homeland, as it were, in the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And here it's important to note that Hungary and Hungarian culture are really central to understanding Satmar Hasidism. This movement emerged in Hungary, in Hungarian culture, notwithstanding the fact that the separatist tendencies that the group became known for were evident already in this period. But there's a strong sense of identification with Hungarian culture, certainly when Satmar made its way to the United States. The community was really shaped by the charismatic presence of the founding Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, after whom the community is named, born in Austro-Hungary in 1887, made his way to a community as town rabbi in 1934 that once upon a time was called Satmar, but after 1920 was called Satu-Mare, when the region transferred from Hungary to Romania. It's interesting that the Satmar community existed only for 10 years in Europe, from 1934 to 1944, when Nazi Germany invaded Hungary, and within a few short months had deported much of the Jewish population of that region to concentration and death camps. Joel Teitelbaum makes his way to the United States in 1946, settles in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, but very quickly determines that alongside a presence for what he hoped would be his reconstituted community in Brooklyn, it was also important to establish a satellite, a kind of safe haven, a spiritual enclave, at a remove from the city, at a remove from the the seductions and allures of a teeming urban environment. And he entrusted the task of finding such a place to his chief aides, who spent decades trying to do so, unsuccessfully, beginning in the late 40s, moving to Staten Island in 1953, in New Jersey in the early 1960s, in various parts of suburban New York in the late 60s, and finally in 1972, a piece of land was purchased in the town of Monroe, New York. Originally, the conception was to establish a neighborhood, a place at a remove from the rest of the town of Monroe, where a group of Satmar Hasidim could practice their religion as they saw fit without any disturbance or interruption. And the community back in Brooklyn sent representatives who oversaw the construction of the first 80 garden apartments and 25 single-family homes. And then 2 years later, the first residents, Satmar residents, began to come from Brooklyn to the town of Monroe, and thus begins the story of this community. It was originally imagined in Satmar lore as a shtetl, as a small enclave. Shtetl is the Yiddish word for small town or village, and usually referred to an area in Eastern Europe where there was a substantial portion or population of Jews. And many of us when we hear the word shtetl, we conjure up the image of the community depicted in Fiddler on the Roof. And that's, in some sense, the mythic shtetl, which is distinct from the actual historical shtetl, which was never as homogeneous in demographic or political or religious terms as the sort of classic Anatevka was in its earlier iteration before transformations began to affect it. But shtetl in Europe typically had a majority of Jewish residents in close proximity to non-Jewish communities. What's interesting about Kiryas Joel is that really it was reimagined, more along the lines of the mythic shtetl than the historic shtetl, more along the lines of a place of homogeneity in every imaginable way, most importantly, religiously. And this ideal took rise in 1974, and everything seemed to be going along swimmingly for a few months, until tensions arose over zoning regulations. What constituted really a single-family home? Right? If you were two families related to each other and you each had 8 or 10 kids and you lived in a single abode, does that constitute a single-family home? According to the zoning officials of the town of Monroe, it did not. Could you have a nursery school or a bakery or a ritual bath in the basement of a garden apartment? Is that legal according to zoning regulations of the town of Monroe? And disputes over things like this prompted very significant tension between the new residents of this neighborhood of Monroe and town officials. And after 2 years of very serious tension and threats of litigation, it was decided by both sides that the most amenable and expeditious path was to carve out of the town of Monroe a village, a self-standing village that would be able to regulate its own zoning. And thus was born the village of Kiryas Joel. The decision was made in 1976, and then it was officially incorporated in 1977. And I'll just say, to sort of pass things off to Nomi, it was a community almost without precedent in the history of modern Jewish diaspora existence. Never has there been a community that homogeneous in demographic, political, and religious terms that also managed to carve out for itself what we call a form of local sovereignty, gaining recognition from the state as a formally recognized entity. I'm somewhat overstating the case because 16 years earlier, a smaller Hasidic movement, the Square Hasidim, actually sort of attempted sort of a trial run when they moved out to suburban New York, actually to Rockland County, and established there a community that, because of tensions over zoning, was later incorporated in 1961 as New Square, New York. New Square doesn't have the size, the heft, or I would say the imperial ambitions of Kiryas Joel and Satmar Hasidim. But this is a shtetl, but a shtetl in a certain sense unlike any other.
Yeah, so hello everyone, it's wonderful to see you. So as you hear from David, the book tells the story of the Satmar Hasidim who created the village of Kiryas Joel, just about an hour from here. But it's also about, or I would say it also addresses the question of what is it about America? What was it about America in the time period in which this village was formed that was so conducive, that was so enabling of the Satmars' ability not only to create this private enclave, but then to transform that private association into an officially recognized municipality of, for, and by the Satmars. Very stringently observant, religiously observant group. So first of all, the fact that America was, or I would say still is, conducive to this kind of religious separatist project is, at least to some people, surprising. Our thesis, and the title of one of the chapters of our book, is really that this shouldn't be surprising, that it's only in America that this could have happened. And as David has said, this so-called shtetl is unlike the shtetls of yore. No shtetl in Europe was exclusively populated by Jews. In the shtetls, the Jewish population not only lived side by side with Gentiles, but was internally heterogeneous. And in no shtetl in Europe was the Jewish community politically empowered. And our thesis really is that this degree of homogeneity, separation, and then political empowerment really could only have happened here. But that flies in the face of many people's views of what America is and what is permitted under the American legal system and the Constitution. And certainly in the time period in which the community was being formed, starting in the 70s, I think part of the explanation is that there's more than one vision of America and what America stands for. The 1970s was a time of retreat from the liberal integrationist vision of the United States that had taken rise in the post-war era and really in the 50s and 60s. That vision of America, that liberal vision as a place of integration as opposed to segregation, was being rejected widely across the political spectrum. That's partly a story about the rise of the American conservative movement, and in particular, the religious wing of the American conservative movement, the religious right. So the book really talks about the rise of the religious right and the changes that induced in American culture and politics that made it much more receptive to this kind of religious separatist project, and the changes in the way that American law and the First Amendment was interpreted. But it's not only a story about the influence of the conservative movement, because in this same time period, integration was being challenged by many voices on the left. I mean, that really perhaps begins in the 60s with the Black Power movement and Black nationalism. In the 1970s, You see the emergence of a discourse of communitarianism, and then that sort of morphs into multiculturalism. And the communitarian critique of liberalism asserted and lamented that in American society, because America's legal system and political culture is devoted to the protection of the rights of the individual and individual freedom of choice and freedom of belief, and elevates the individual over the group, the belief was that those principles, those rights, would undermine, would lead to the dissolution and the disappearance of traditional religious communities, that there was something maybe sort of paradoxically intolerant about liberalism, that it was not a hospitable culture for traditional religious communities that are internally organized in hierarchical fashions, observing traditional gender norms, that such groups could not flourish. And what we see in the story of Kiryas Joel is that just the opposite is the case. That the most liberal features, the most individualistic features of the American political system and legal system, these were the building blocks for the Satmars. What am I referring to? Most obviously, the right to freedom of religion, but also the rights to private property, the rights to freedom of contract, the libertarian tradition. That system, a free market system, maybe unsurprisingly, the same market forces, particularly in the real estate market, that enabled, and we might even say promoted, socioeconomic and racial segregation, were tools that the Satmars could use. Very simply, how do you separate from other people? Well, assuming you have the capital, and of course, in a free market system, the ability to use these tools is dependent on that. You do what the Satmars did, which is you buy a big tract of land and you subdivide it and you develop it and you sell it off only to members of your community. And that private pathway to political empowerment, what we call communitarianism from the bottom up, is in fact very American. There's a long history of religious communities and other kinds of communities, separatist communities, utopian communities, following that private pathway to the creation of their own separate and separatist autonomous communities. And that is very much part of the story of the creation of Kiryas Joel.
Well, I think you can all tell how rich this book is. So there's so many threads I want to pull there. I'm going to do my best to combine two things, which is, you talked about kind of the push and pull between American models of integration and separatism. But there was also quite a push and pull and a diversity of thought within the community about what their role and responsibility to the US government was, and whether it was a good idea to form the separatist community. And I was wondering if you could speak more about that, but also if I can add in another layer. You also speak quite a lot in the book about what you call unwitting assimilation. And how I thought it was so interesting how this showed up in many, many different ways, from attitudes towards disability to use of the legal system to later, as you mentioned, perhaps a turn towards right-wing politics. So I wonder if you could kind of put those two questions together and talk a bit about the diversity of thought about the state and the role of religion in the state within the community, and also, whether and how this idea of unwitting assimilation played a role in that tension.
Okay, well, thank you for pointing to this really important observation, Liz, because to the naked outside eye, the community seems to be a sea of uniformity. And in fact, it is filled with divisions and a wide range of expressions and characters. And people sometimes ask, what was it like to spend time with the community? And for the most part, it was actually quite thrilling in being exposed to a wide range of perspectives, seemingly confined within a very small physical and religious space. There's a kind of idyllic first phase in the history of Satmar America, which runs from the arrival of the Rebbe, the Grand Rebbe, Joel Teitelbaum in 1946, up to 1979, the year of his death. So 2 years after Kiryas Joel was established, Joel Teitelbaum, who had already been in a debilitated state for about a decade after he suffered a stroke, passes with no direct family heir. He was predeceased by his 3 daughters. He had no sons, and it wasn't entirely clear what would happen for a short period of time. And then sort of the most obvious candidate surfaced, who was his nephew, Moshe Teitelbaum, who was appointed first rabbi of the community and then, after the mourning period, Rebbe of the global Satmar dynasty. And what's interesting to note is almost from the beginning, it was clear that he would lack the authority and validity as the unquestioned leader of the community, which is to say that a group of opponents took rise who would later call themselves the Sons of Joel, who were not willing to accept the authority of this second person, pretender to the throne. And what's so interesting about that first group of dissidents is the symbolic, and some might argue political leader of that group was none other than the Rebbitzin, the widow of the first rabbi, known as Alta Feiga. This begins a succession battle that to a certain extent has not been resolved to this day, which is to say that the Satmar world has been riven by division over who is the legitimate heir to the charismatic founding Rebbe, a crisis of the transmission of charismatic authority, something that the great sociologist Max Weber was very attuned to. How do you transmit charisma from generation to generation? And in fact, Moshe Teitelbaum lacked the charisma and spiritual authority of his uncle, and made a number of decisions that further deepened strife within the community, one of which was in 1999 to essentially divide the Satmar Empire into 2 halves, appointing one son as chief rabbi of Kiryas Joel, one of the capitals of the Satmar Empire, and another son as the chief rabbi of Williamsburg, the other larger, actually, center of the Satmar world. And this division played out at times in fierce, even violent ways, in many rounds of litigation, and to a certain extent, in differing conceptions of how to relate to the state. The group that adopted the attitude that the Satmar world should really hold firm to the classic Talmudic principle of dina dimachulta dina, the law of the kingdom of the state is the law to which you should adhere and be subservient, was the original traditionalist dissident faction, the Sons of Joel. And they would actually go on to, or some of its members or associated members, would go on to even call for the dissolution of the village, which they believed was antithetical to that tradition of subservience to the state. They believed it was not proper for Jews, and particularly Satmar Hasidic Jews to assume the reins of political power. And some continue to hold that view to this day. It happens to be the fact they're the ones who don't possess political power. So it is interesting to ask the counterfactual, what if they did? And Nomi can tell about a moment when that counterfactual almost came to fruition, but turned out in a very interesting way. By contrast, the mainstream faction in Kiryas Joel, that associated with the eldest son of Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum, namely Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum, is, in a certain sense, the political and religious establishment, and they have made it their business to engage the state in many ways, which, by the way, extends back to a tradition that we saw already in Hungary, whereby Joel Teitelbaum entrusted the task to his lieutenants of engaging political authorities so as to advance the interests of the community. There's a very long tradition of that in Jewish history, epitomized in the figure of the Shtadlan, the intercessor who acts on behalf of the community with the royal court. So there is a tradition of this engagement. And indeed, the Aaronites, the Aronis in Kiryas Joel, have done that to, I would say, remarkably successful effect over the strenuous objections of some of the dissidents who have said this is really a violation of the tradition of quietism and subservience that is deeply ingrained into our sense of dwelling in exile. So even while we recognize that the United States is a malchus shel chesed, a kingdom of grace, we're in exile, and this is our place. So this is one indication of a division, a substantial division over attitudes to the state.
Right, but there's been a recent development. There's been a recent change. So before I get to that, David's talking about how there's this division, really a great schism within the community. And in certain ways, they have different, what we might call political theology. The mainstream establishment party believes it's acceptable for them to run a village and run a town and hold local political office, whereas the so-called dissidents, they object to that and say that's a violation of the Satmars' traditional renunciation of the exercise of political power. And that idea is very characteristic of religious, quietist, separatist groups in many traditions, right? The exercise of political power is inherently corrupt, and in order to be spiritually pure, you have to withdraw from the world and from worldly affairs and not exercise political power yourself. So that is a point of disagreement between the mainstream party and the dissidents. But at least until recently, there has been really no real disagreement between the two parties as to the propriety. There's a third party, but as to the propriety, there's been no disagreement amongst any of the factions until recently. With respect to the halachic principle, the principle of Jewish law that David referred to, according to which the law of the kingdom. The law of the kingdom is the law. That's really the halachic, the Jewish counterpart, equivalent to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? That's to say, you have to respect the authority of the state, and indeed, the exercise of power by a legitimate state is divinely ordained, and it's divinely ordained upon us, even though we want to withdraw as much as possible, to accept and respect the authority of the state. And the disagreements among the competing factions are really not over the principles, but who's adhering to those principles, who's more of a separatist and who is more faithful to the principle that the law of the kingdom is the law. So there's been no disagreement, and in that regard, that makes this religious community, which in some regards you might say is like other fundamentalist communities, it makes it very different from many conservative Christian communities, not all, which have adopted a much more defiant attitude towards the state. I mean, there are strains of evangelical Christianity, there are strains of, let's say, ultra-conservative Catholicism that do not, that really question, if not out and out reject the authority of the state or assert, that sort of their understanding of religious law is supreme and the state is subordinate. So that's a big difference. It is only recently, and really after our research, we wrapped up our research on this book. We had been researching it for many years in 2019. And it was really only after that, but before the book was published, so we hurried and wrote an introduction. What happened? We had a pandemic. We had the implementation of COVID regulations. And, as I'm sure is well known to New Yorkers, Satmars and other Hasidic and Haredi Jewish groups joined with conservative Christian groups and organizations in resisting the enforcement of COVID regulations, but more than that, in claiming the right not to have to follow the law, in essence, right? That was new. The manifestation of this kind of defiance of state authority, which is a familiar strain of the Christian-led religious right, that was really foreign to Satmar culture. And we also saw, right, what else was going on? Well, we were in the last, what was it? Seemed like an endless period of time, but I guess year and a half of, I hope, the Trump presidency. And we also saw manifestations of, and we're not sure yet whether it was Trumpism or simply support for Trump. Most vividly, in the 2016 election, David will know the exact figures, but the community was pretty evenly split. A slight majority in favor of Trump, 53%, and the rest of the community went for Hillary. In 2020, 99% for Trump. There are signs, and here you asked about unwitting assimilation. This would be the most ironic example of unwitting assimilation. And we're not sure yet. David, and he can talk about this, has just sort of convened a new research group to study what's actually going on. So we don't know for sure. We have to qualify. But there are signs of the possibility that at least some elements of the Satmar community have actually started to absorb the political attitudes and ideology of the Christian right, and specifically this, in essence, rejection of the traditional principle that the law of the kingdom is the law of the land, render unto Caesars. We accept, and indeed we respect and even revere the authority of the state. That was the characteristic attitude towards the state, and maybe it still is, but there are signs of a possible change. I
just want to qualify one thing that Nomi said, or amplify and address the question of unwitting assimilation. So she suggested this possible turn away from a pragmatic transactionalism in politics toward an ideological conservatism, if it turns out to be the case, and we need further research, would be an indication of that kind of unwitting assimilation. And by that we mean assimilation in the sense of absorbing the norms and practices of the mainstream is regarded as the gravest threat that the Satmar community faces. Assimilation is a highly negative phenomenon, and yet what we have noticed is that certainly, throughout Jewish history, but in Satmar's existence in the United States, it has absorbed especially legal and political norms from American society that have enabled it to maintain its own separatist existence. Most significantly for our purposes, and this is where I want to qualify the the quietism that both of us spoke about, in playing the game of interest group politics. So people from the outside say, here's a group of people who are sort of exploiting the system, they're sort of manipulating things in order to get very particular benefits for their community. And that is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is they're just very good at the nature of the game, which is aggregate power through very considerable internal cohesion and discipline, and then apply pressure through lobbying techniques and then ultimately a block vote. And they have been very effective at that. And that sort of qualifies somewhat the ethos of submission, because they have played that game very well. And sometimes they've thrown around their heft with real force. And so we see that as a real characteristic of this unwitting assimilation. It reminds me of what one town leader once told me when he was describing the tension between the two leading factions in town, that associated with the mainstream group of Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum and that associated with his younger brother, Zalman Leib, who was the chief rabbi in Williamsburg. He said, we have become a two-party system here in Kiryas Joel, right? And I thought, this is what unwitting assimilation is about, even though he was winking and saying, like, we win every election, but sort of applying that same discipline to play and skill at interest group politics internally within the community.
So I don't want to press you too much. I know it's an area of further research, but I do think this kind of recent turn of events is so interesting. And I think last time we spoke, David, you talked about it as, this move from a marriage of convenience, because the Christian right has partnered with this community for a long time on specific litigation when it's sort of in everyone's interest, right? To this real ideological affinity. And, I would love for you to go a little deeper into what you think might be driving this transition. And also, if you witnessed when you were there any concern about this, any concern about Christian nationalism, what the ultimate goals of the Christian right movement is and what it means for Jews.
Yeah. Well, I have heard from people like that handful of people who did not vote for Donald Trump in the community about their concern about sort of the kind of uniformity of not just electoral behavior, but mindset. That sees or saw Donald Trump as kind of a redemptive figure in one regard, and this I think gets to the heart of the question, as someone who delivered on the ideal of religious liberties. It's about religious liberty, and the COVID restrictions really highlighted the threat to religious liberty. So, we have to understand, and this is our point about the Americanness of the Shtetl, Kiryas Joel is part of the landscape of the United States. The arc of that community parallels the arc of the rise of the religious right in this country. The Nomi majority was born 2 years after KJ. And in fact, Christian conservatives have been very supportive of Kiryas Joel, of the idea of a public school in Kiryas Joel, and have seen their interests very much aligned. And what we have seen even more recently is that there's a kind of returning of the favor insofar as residents of Kiryas Joel very deeply resonate with this discourse and principle of religious liberty as sort of the paramount American liberty, right? The free exercise of religion trumps, pun intended, even public health restrictions. And I think that entwinement of interests between traditionalist Jews and traditionalist Christians over religious liberties may well spell a new era of ideological conservatism. I mean, I've heard it in talking with people in the community that they really resonate with that. They don't necessarily say, the people I've spoken to, and I see my fellow Christian conservatives as partners in this task, but they understand what's going on at the Supreme Court. They understand, that the threat lies in the legal system, which was not as willing to always accede to their demands, and their demands, by the way, are about seeking to remove impingements on their way of life. They see it as nothing less than that. So there's a sense of existential threat around religious liberties that may exercise this transformative effect, and we just don't know.
And there's one particular site where that sense of threat is, I think, most acute, and that is education. That is the laws that regulate or don't regulate private schools, and the laws that, and we'll see what, this very week, it would not be surprising if the Supreme Court hands down a decision addressing the issue of public funding for private schools. So the most recent site of controversy that I think is part of the explanation for why we're seeing a change of attitudes, which I'm sure is familiar to some people in this room, if not all of you, is over the enforcement or lack of enforcement of New York State's education laws against yeshivas, right? So for a very long time, all private schools are subject to the regulation of the state education department, which, in addition to prescribing things like safety standards for buildings, prescribes minimum education standards. That is to say, it requires the teaching of secular education. And for many years, the yeshivas did not fulfill that. And indeed, over time, they have fulfilled it less and less. The amount of secular education has steadily decreased. Until recently, it was a non-issue because the state just looked the other way. And that has changed with the advent of an organization that was founded by young men who grew up in these communities and are products of the yeshivas and have left the community and struggle to find employment and feel like they're severely disadvantaged, and they feel like their right to an education, and specifically their right to a secular education, which is guaranteed by state law, has been violated by the state, right? They're not suing their community. But that connects to long-standing issues, right? I think the original alliance, which was much less ideological, but the original common cause between Orthodox Jews broadly and conservative Christians was public funding for private schools, private religious schools. And there has been a relentless, half-century campaign to reverse the policy established by the Supreme Court starting in 1947 and continuing through the 60s, according to which the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which prohibits the establishment of religion by the state, embodies a principle of separation between religion and state that prohibits state funding of private schools. And we all know the controversies over vouchers and so on and so forth. The campaign to get the Supreme Court to change that position and permit states to fund private schools, and maybe, watch for the news this week, even to require states to fund schools, private schools, including religious ones, without excluding religious ones. That has been a common cause. In so long as the state wasn't enforcing those regulations of private schools, there was no reason to object to the state. You could have your separatism, and it could coexist with this traditional posture of respect for the authority of the state. But now that there is a threat that the state might enforce its laws against religious schools in a way that would conflict with their sense of what a religious education requires, I think that goes a long way towards explaining this new receptivity to this, I think it really has been incubated in the Christian right, this ideology that implies an attitude of defiance and the right not to
a
submit to the
combativeness,
authority of the state
a combativeness, and also
in the name of religious liberty.
also a reinforced alliance between Hasidic Jews and the Christian conservative world around the demand that private schools and particularly yeshivas meet what are known as substantial equivalency regulations or requirements. So in recent years, in recent months, we've seen a reinforcement of that alliance over this demand, often brought on by exiters from the community, that the private school world be held to that standard.
So interesting, and it makes me think about the history of the Christian right, and again, this kind of period of withdrawal from politics, and then activation, particularly around kind of the denial of tax status to segregation, religious segregation academies. So there's so much we didn't get to. You all have to read the book to get more, but I do want to get to some audience questions. So I'm going to try to do a twofer, which is. What was it like doing research in the communities? And if you can include, Nomi, if you faced any kind of restrictions as a woman. And then also, what was the community response to the book?
Shall I begin? Go ahead.
I'll go first with it. So, so we use many different methodologies, right? Many different, there was researching legal records. There was a lot of learning. We had learning the history of education law, learning local government law, learning about the history of this community, learning about the history of Hasidism, learning many things. One of them was a more kind of ethnographic method of actually going to the community and interviewing, talking with people, and also talking with people who don't live in the community but have played important roles in the community. I did a lot of that. I spoke to lawyers and people who are parties to lawsuits. And unlike David, and I'm going to let David describe, David spent a lot of time in the community in a quasi-ethnographic manner, and I didn't. And we thought long and hard about it, because this is a community that adheres to very traditional gender norms and norms of gender segregation. So that meant two things. It meant, first of all, there are some interesting exceptions. David alluded to the role of the original founding Rebbe's widow. Of course, there are some women who have played important leadership roles in the community. We both spoke with them. But officially, the leaders of the community are all men. The public face of the community is male. And of course, the public side of the community is much more accessible to outside observers. So first of all, the parts of the community that would be most accessible to us would be predominantly, if not exclusively, male. Then what happens if a woman, what if I went instead of David? Or what if I went alongside David? Or how could either I, probably better me, or David gain access to the lives of women? So that was like a quandary, exacerbated by the fact that we live in California, the opposite side of the country, and we were raising 3 children and had jobs and we're doing lots of other things and are not trained as, and really what I thought, and we thought, we had a lot of discussions about it, that the only way to kind of overcome the gender bias that was just inherent in that method would be to do like a really like kind of old-fashioned cultural be like Margaret Mead, like embed in the community and do like a long-term participant observation. Sure, then one could get access to intimate life, to private life, to the lives of women, and to the lives of men in the more private domain. Well, that wasn't in the cards, right? I mean, I couldn't like pick up a, so, and it was like, well, I could like parachute in and like interview a few women. I really felt like that would be worse than nothing. So we just had to sort of confront and be very aware that there was a gender bias in this, and think of ways of correcting it, starting with just the awareness of it. So I chose not to. Whereas David,
Yeah, so I'm trained as an intellectual historian, which is to say I read texts of dead people who don't move or squirm too much. And yet I understood when I made my first entreaty to the community that I was going to have to acquire a different set of tools, that I was dealing with living subjects, and that required a different understanding and a different method. And I have to say, from the beginning, it was a source of extraordinary exhilaration. I mean, the entire experience, apart from the fact that I remain happily married to Nomi after nearly 2 decades of work on this book, apart from that, I mean, just the subject was so ceaselessly interesting because of the phenomenon itself and that internal diversity that we talked about at the beginning. So the way it began is I actually wrote a letter to the first, to the community and asked if I could come and study it. And I didn't expect to get an answer back, and I did. And I was told, yes, you can come. And when I got there, I sort of queried the people whom I was meeting and asked, well, why? They said, well, after 25 years or so, we're actually interested in someone holding up a mirror to us. We're actually interested in seeing how we look. And we're also interested in seeing how we look to people from the outside who we feel are neutral observers. And thus began my entry into the world. So I was not embedded for months at a time, but went on dozens of occasions to Kiryas Joel for a day or two, sometimes 3 days. And I had one real advantage, which was that there were these kind of very formidable divisions within the community. So people would say, well, whom did you speak to last? And I would say, I spoke to someone from Team A, and that person was from Team B. And that person would say, come into my office and sit down in the corner. And usually I would be told, look, I only have 15 minutes. And then like 3 hours later, I'd be, late for 2 meetings that I had scheduled. People were really interested in talking about the community. They were interested in talking about the divisions. They were interested in talking about the achievement of the community. They were interested in talking about what was problematic about it. Reminding us Satmar Hasidim are people with a wide range of, with a wide emotional register and, a diverse range of opinions. The response to the book, it's important to me. And there are a number of people whose opinions really mattered to us. One of them happens to be in the room. And I will just say that what we have heard uniformly, first of all, the book would be read by a very small percentage of people in the community, a handful of people.
you're not supposed to read secular literature.
Yeah, it's not the
or
kind of thing that
consume
it would be
material.
idle, a case of engaging in idleness rather than studying Torah, to read a book such as this. But there are inquiring minds in the community. There are people who read books like this. And from what we've heard, for the most part, from the handful of people who have responded, it has been uniformly positive across the ideological spectrum, which is really interesting. We declare at the outset, we don't come to condemn or condone. And frankly, that pissed a lot of people off because they really wanted their perspective validated and affirmed. But, our goal was to capture that diversity within the uniformity. And, one acquaintance would phone in observations about the book after reading like 25 pages. He said, I'm 25 pages in, It's actually not bad.
I'm
In
25 pages
two to
in. I didn't know how it would be, but it's pretty good.
2 days later, I'm on page 77. My wife says it's good. And, there's a lot that's wanting in the book, but for the most part, I think we've tried to be fair and even-handed, and that's what we've heard so far.
Great. Thank you so much. There are a few other great questions, but I'm afraid it's past 7:30, so you will be signing
Yes,
books
happily.
outside. So please pick up your copy, and just thank you so much for the conversation and for this
Thank
wonderful
you,
book.
Liz.